Hang tight, all you. Part 3 of Show Me Hope Again series by Anathemis on Archive of Our Own. Summary. Denki Kaminari was, undoubtedly, the clown of Class 2A. He was a jokester, the idiot, loud and fidgety, liked by most, loved by a few, namely, his squad, although Bakugo would claim otherwise. What his class didn't know, however, was that he struggled with the idea of being seen as the class clown. Or, Aizawa Shota realizing that maybe his students aren't hopeless after all, just in need of a bit of extra help to see what others have missed. Denki Kaminari was, undoubtedly, the clown of Class 2A. He was a jokester, the idiot, loud and fidgety, liked by most, loved by few, namely, his squad, although Bakugo would claim otherwise. What his class didn't know, however, was that he struggled with the idea of being seen as the class clown. He hated it, in fact. He wanted to be seen as clever or as studious and chill, but try as he might, he simply couldn't. Combined with his quirk and his other irritating quips, he couldn't even get a passing grade on most of his tests. Like the one he just failed, his third in a row. Denki's forced smile dropped when he saw the red-circled 11 out of 100. He'd really tried this time, even though his leg didn't stop bouncing, and Jiro kept shushing his pen clicking, and his hands didn't stop twitching, and his ears kept tuning into the clock ticking, and his scalp was itchy, and it hurt to scratch it, but it was so damn itchy. But no, even after all of that, he still failed. For a moment, his heart clenched, and there was a sudden onslaught of thoughts. You'll never become a hero if you can't even pass a test. You're so annoying, and you deserve to fail. You're just a fucking idiot, and a good-for-nothing child. But he brushed them all away, taking a deep breath before schooling his expression back into his neutral, nonchalant demeanor, turning to Kirishima and proudly waving his test around. "Failure number 3, no surprise there," he yelled, just over the top of the rest of the class, chattering good-naturedly about their own scores. Kirishima barked in laughter, lifting his own test to show 62 out of 100. For a moment, Denki felt those familiar thoughts encroach for the second time today, but he just smiled sincerely and stuck his thumb up to show Kirishima he was proud of his buddy. He felt eyes on him and blinked before turning to face the corner of the classroom. Sensei, from his sleeping bag cocoon, was staring at Denki with a curious look on his face. When Aizawa knew Denki spotted him staring, he went back to feigning sleep, rolling over. Denki's eyebrows furrowed before he shook it off, turning to ask Jiro what score she got, ignoring the wave of shame he felt when he spotted her 81 out of 100. On the outside, he just congratulated her, pretending not to see Momo's woe at her 98 out of 100. On the inside, he was wrought with turmoil, thoughts of being a terrible student and never being able to succeed in life. Oh, he was such a mess. It's not like he didn't study or anything. In fact, he spent hours upon hours every day studying, when the rest of the dorms were silent and the dark was too oppressive. He tucked himself into his desk chair and studied until his head hurt and his eyes were blurring, desperate to do well on just one damn test. Maybe show Aizawa that he wasn't at the bottom of the class. In the end, though, it seemed like it was all for nothing. No information retained, even after all the time he pored over the texts. He tuned back into the outside world, laughing at Bakugo's anger that Deku scored higher than him, not noticing the eyes still boring into his skull from under the shade of a sleeping bag. Not a week later, Denki got back another test in homeroom, this time with a large 9 out of 100 written on the top. After a week of little sleep and thunderstorms causing his quirk to randomly flare throughout the day and dance electricity across his body, he just didn't have the effort to make jokes about it, especially when it wasn't really funny. Instead, he just sighed deeply, resting his head on his crossed arms on his desk, clenching his eyes shut and somehow holding back tears. He heard the joyous outcries of those around him and shakily inhaled, sitting up and raising his hand in desperation. He ignored the question of his friends around him, glaring in the direction of Aizawa. Sensei, who didn't even ask, but was already watching Denki, merely nodded. The class watched in confusion as Denki shot out of his seat, opening the door to the corridor so forcefully that it banged against the wall. All that was heard was Denki's footsteps pounding on the ground as he ran away, fading into the distance. Soon, the class resumed their chattering about their scores, but Aizawa remained staring at Denki's seat, mind turning ideas over and over. Denki finally surfaced from his bedroom about 10 hours later, well past curfew, having not attended a single lesson. He'd stopped crying about 4 hours into his impromptu day off, with the other 6 filled with random bouts of anger and needs for stimulation. At one point, he started to pace his bedroom, then jog around it, then skip, but nevertheless, he felt like his body didn't quite fit right, like his skin was stretched over his bones too taut. By hour 9, he was staring at the night sky, ignoring the knocking on his door and concerned questions from his friends, and chewing on his already absent fingernails and cuticles. They were stinging and bleeding in places, but it was better than stewing in thoughts about how he was a waste of space. Hunger was winning him over, and he knew he had to leave the damn room before he ripped his entire fingernail off and decided to paint the walls a different color, because the current one was hurting his eyes more than usual. Used to his odd eating habits and a regular schedule, he left his room without any trouble, making his way into the kitchen. However, before he got there, he heard hushed voices from the front room, and he backtracked, hiding behind the doorframe. Normally, he wouldn't eavesdrop, but after hearing his name whispered, he had to know what was being said. It was, oddly enough, Aizawa and present Mike sat together on the couch, not quite touching, still trying to hide their relationship, apparently, but close enough that they could whisper. "He failed the test today, too," Aizawa muttered, running a hand down his face. "He needs someone to step in." "I know," Mike replied, the quietest Denki had ever heard him. "He's not doing great in English either. He's got the ideas down and can speak it fluently, but he can't get any of it down on paper. It's just a jumbled mess of scribbles and doodles, not even relevant to the lesson. He wrote down every quote he could remember once, all translated into English, with only a few errors, while the rest of the class were practicing nouns." Aizawa smiled a bit, shaking his head in what could be described as a fond way, but Denki didn't see it that way. He felt like Aizawa was mocking him, making a joke of it. The lesson that Mike was talking about was a day that Denki could barely keep his quirk under control during a thunderstorm, and decided to do whatever his brain wanted him to do, whilst he voraciously chewed a pen lid to pieces, all in an effort to distract himself. "He needs to see a doctor," Aizawa whispered, and Mike nodded in reply. Denki, however, was panicking behind the doorframe. "A doctor? Why would he need a doctor? Is something wrong with him? Is he going to be kicked out?" Before the 2 teachers noticed his quickened breathing, he slapped a hand over his mouth and ran back to his room, slamming the door shut and not caring if it woke people up. He threw himself onto his bed, tugging the covers over his head, screaming silently with tears running down his face. He wasn't hungry anymore. In fact, he felt sick. The morning after, he didn't even remember falling asleep, meaning he woke up extremely late without setting any alarms, and even if he rushed, he would barely make it to homeroom. After missing yesterday, he couldn't afford to miss any more lessons, so he scrubbed his face with a wipe, threw his clothes on, and ran out the door, barely remembering his book bag. He internally kept his panic under control, running to his homeroom as fast as he could. He slammed the door open just as the rest of the class were standing to leave, panting. He groaned, keeling over a little, hands on his knees. Aizawa looked in his direction, but waved him off as he started to try making excuses, letting him follow the rest of the classmates to his next lesson. He sighed and turned to follow them, mentally preparing for more lessons, even though he woke up less than 15 minutes ago. Well, there's nothing more he could do. During lunch that day, he sat alone in the cafeteria, not being able to stand his friends for more than 5 minutes. Their boisterous and loud behavior was grating on him, so much that his head began to ache, though that could have been attributed to his dehydration from crying for hours. Nevertheless, he slipped his earphones in, turning the music up as loud as possible and zoning out. The texture of the rice icked him a bit, and he gagged quietly, pushing it to the side with his fork. Not a knife. He couldn't use a knife. Never did. Halfway through his meal, an earphone was pulled from his ear by the wire, and he jerked to the left, dropping his fork. "Apologies, Kaminari," Aizawa muttered, stepping back a little. Denki blinked a little, laughing. "It's chill, Sensei," he replied. "Did you need something?" Aizawa nodded, looking around a little. "When you're done eating, meet me outside Principal Nezu's office." The fear returned, and Denki gulped before nodding, pushing the rest of his food away. "I'm ready now, sir," he whispered, before standing on shaky legs and tucking his phone and earphones away. Aizawa nodded before making his way to the corridor leading to the offices. Denki followed him closely behind, feeling the stares of his friends, but not turning to meet their eyes. He wasn't able to stand the shame. He knew where this was going. He'd have to break the news to his parents, that he was being kicked out of the prestigious school of UA, and that there was something so inherently wrong with him that he was being referred to a damn doctor. They wouldn't be pleased. Not that they ever were. Hence the lack of communication. They were soon stood outside the door of Nezu's office, present Mike having stepped in line with them at some point. The senseis exchanged glances before knocking on the door, ushering Denki in when they heard the call to enter. Aizawa pointed at a chair in front of the desk, and he sat down heavily, leg twitching out of nervousness. He clicked his fingers a few times, feeling the sparks between his fingers, hoping it'd settle some of the energy building inside of him. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work. Aizawa and Mike stood behind him, perhaps trying to feel comforting, but only feeling like a threat to Denki's poor mind. Nezu looked between the three people stood before him, sipping his tea. "What brings you here today, gentlemen?" the hybrid asked. "Well, we'd like to ask permission to—" Denki couldn't hold his silence any longer. "I'm sorry, Sensei. I promise I'll try harder. I promise. I'll study more. I'll go to catch-up lessons. I don't care what I have to do, but please don't kick me out." He turned around mid-rant, pleading eyes staring into Aizawa's shocked ones. "Kaminari, calm down. You're not being expelled from UA. We're here to ask if we can refer you to a doctor. Because there's something wrong with me, right? That's why I'm so stupid." "Kaminari, my little dude, calm down. You're not stupid, and there's nothing wrong with you. We promise," Mike interrupted, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We want to see if we can get you a diagnosis for your ADHD. Kaminari froze, before turning around sharply to face Mike. "My... what?" Aizawa sighed, turning to Principal Nezu again. "Do we have your permission to take Kaminari to a doctor?" Nezu merely smiled, raising his teacup to his little snout again. "Gentlemen, you needn't ask." With that, both Aizawa and Mike relaxed a little, whilst Denki was still overcome with confusion. "What's ADHD?" he asked, but Aizawa merely grasped him by his jacket and raised him from his seat. "Come on, kid," he said, dragging him from the room. "Okay, Dad," Denki replied, jokingly, momentarily forgetting his confusion for reinforcing the idea that Aizawa was the dad of Class 2A. Mike followed, laughing, shutting the door on their way out. A mere 2 weeks later, Denki was handed an envelope by Aizawa in the middle of homeroom. His diagnosis. Did he have ADHD, or was he just an idiot all along? He didn't wait for the privacy of his bedroom, like his sensei gently suggested, tearing the envelope open and barely missing the actual paper inside. He unfolded it with his eyes closed, before placing it down on his desk and taking a deep breath. This moment would define the rest of his life. He just knew it would. After the meeting with Nezu, he had had an appointment scheduled for the next day, wherein he was assessed in depth by the medical team at the Musatafu hospital. The results, as expected, were yielded from a combo of a quirk that assesses the brain and a psychologist. The questions were very odd, things like, are you good at task organization, and can you remember dates and important appointments, and are you likely to delay a large task, and do you find certain loud or distracting settings to overwhelm you? After each answer, the psychologist just muttered a quick, interesting, and moved on. He didn't take that as a good sign. Before his results came in, he spent a lot of time researching ADHD and what it means, how people handle it, and whatnot. He found himself relating to a lot of the stories that he had read, even down to the restlessness and time dissociation and the need to stimulate his body through movement. As it turns out, other people with ADHD also struggled in school due to a lack of knowledge or sufficient support, leaving students with ADHD with poor lesson intake and no ways to cope. The last question he particularly related to. Were you considered clever by your peers and teachers, but found yourself getting lower grades throughout the years? Most definitely, was his answer. Also, apparently common amongst ADHD and those on the autism spectrum was the gifted kid burnout syndrome, going from passing with flying colors to just barely getting by or dropping school entirely, just because their needs weren't met and skills weren't enhanced. As Aizawa had said after the appointment 2 weeks back, even if he didn't have ADHD, it wasn't the end of the world. They'd figure out ways to improve his grades with methods that suited him. No matter now, though. He had the results in front of him, yet couldn't open his eyes. What if this was the whole reason his parents went from pinning his tests to the fridge in pride to berating him and calling him a disappointment? What if it was all because he was simply misunderstood? He was too nervous to find out. He took another deep breath before forcing his eyes open to read what was written. He scanned past the boring bits to the bold print near the middle. Official diagnosis: Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, ADHD. He released his breath, dropping the paper to the desk surface, and slumped in his chair. And that was that. Denki felt a hand close around his shoulder tightly, and another fold the paper on the desk before his curious classmates managed to read it. The hand tightened for a slight moment before releasing again. "Thanks, Dad," Denki whispered, hearing Aizawa huff. "Keep that up and I'll drag you back to Nezu," he replied, gruffly, a joking tone audible. "Stay behind after class, kid. We'll figure this out together." Denki smiled, feeling the weight of the world drop off his shoulders. That's right. They'd figure it out together. A month after his diagnosis was received, Denki was given back another test by Aizawa. These days, he doesn't feel as nervous as he used to, especially as his scores were slowly climbing. He'd gone from 10 out of 100 to 40 out of 100 and even 48 out of 100 in the span of a few weeks. He was very proud of himself, although he owed a lot to Aizawa and Present Mike. Both of them had been recommending new methods of taking in information, such as visual learning and shorthand notes, and even audio recording the lessons on the days his quirk was particularly bad so he could listen back, even providing fidget toys so he wouldn't be clicking his pen or anything during tests. His favorite was the rubber chew ring, as gross as it sounds, because it prevented him from clenching his jaw in an attempt to focus. In fact, not long after his diagnosis, Aizawa started looking into methods to help students like Yuga and Mina revise better, and their grades improve too. Really, their class owed a lot to Aizawa, not only for his dedication, but for his overwhelming heroic behaviors. He'd saved their asses in the battlefield and in the classroom, something everyone, including Denki, appreciated. He really was just their class dad, as much as he pretended to hate it. He smiled down at his 50 out of 100, waving it in the air at Kirishima when he asked what he got, finally feeling like he could become an actual hero. Hello everyone, this is IcarusAudios, and I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. This was part 3 of the Show Me Hope Again series, which I will be continuing in the future. You can find Anathemis on Archive of Our Own or through the link in the description. If you like the content and want more in the future, click the subscribe button to be notified when a new podfic comes out. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.